Welcome to Curious and Quirky, the podcast that unpacks innovation, pokes at conventional wisdom, and occasionally takes an idea all the way to extra time just to see what happens. This isn't your grandpa's podcast. Though if he's caught World Cup fever, he's probably standing 3 feet from the television explaining formations to players he's never even met. Now, each month we bring together the bold, the brilliant, and the slightly rebellious minds from Caltech's Executive Education to explore what leaders and teams mostly get right and what we can learn when the plan gets shown a red card. July has arrived, summer is in full swing, and World Cup fever is everywhere. Suddenly, every conversation involves strategy, teamwork, unexpected upsets, and at least one person confidently questioning a decision they were not remotely qualified to make. Honestly, that sounds a lot like leadership in most of the world that we live in today. Because whether you're competing on the world stage or trying to move one stubborn idea through your organization, success rarely comes from simply having the most talented people. It comes from seeing the whole field, adapting when conditions change, and knowing when it's finally time to stop passing sideways and finally take the shot. So grab your coffee or your halftime hydration of bubble tea or whatever keeps your thinking cool when the pressure heats up, and let's get curious and maybe just a little bit quirky. Okay, and speaking of seeing the field differently, every World Cup has that one player who completely changes the tempo and changes the match after coming off the bench. This month, we've got one of those ourselves. Our special guest, HP Newquist, has some of the most, I'll say, one of the most unexpected resumes I've ever come across. He's an award-winning author, filmmaker, founder of the National Guitar Museum, and he's been studying artificial intelligence since before most of us had even heard the term. Now, while what the rest of the world is debating whether AI will change everything, HP has been watching this match for more than 40 years. Today, he's going to take us beyond the hype and into something even more interesting, asking a very simple question: why are so many people starting to push back on AI? Because every new technology usually creates excitement, but it also creates skepticism, resistance, and occasionally someone yelling at it like it's the referee. Ladies and gentlemen, HP Newquist.
Thanks very much. That's more sports analogies and metaphors than I've ever heard in my life in one opening statement. But thank you for having me. I have been studying AI or been observing AI for 40 years now. There was an original AI back in the late 80s and 90s that died a horrific death and resurrected literally 4 years ago. And so for the last 4 years, people have been wringing their hands and gnashing their teeth about whether they should get into AI. And the obvious answer to that now is a unqualified yes. All of us who used it never want it to go away. It's become as useful as, to some people, as Excel or a Word document. Um, so the idea of AI going away as a technology is not going to happen. Yet there are two things. One, the AI pushback, and the other, AI fatigue, that are causing people and organizations to be concerned about whether they should be using AI. And you look at places like the stock market today, which is already dropping on fears that AI has already been overinvested in. And that's one of those things that's part of the fatigue is that AI companies, there are no pure play AI companies that have gone public yet. So the stock market is not reacting to AI or AI companies. The companies that are being pushed back against in the stock market are all non-pure play AI companies. They all have other businesses. So you've got Microsoft, which even if AI went away, would still have its Office suite and its cloud suite. You've got Google, which even if its Gemini project went away and goes astray, still has Chrome and still has its advertising business. You have Meta, which even if AI went away, still has Facebook. You still have Amazon, which has one of the largest cloud services in the world and sells more gewgaws than anyone else in the world. So if AI went away, all of those companies would still be fine. They might have overinvested, but they'll still be fine because they're not pure play AI companies. So the market is really reacting to the amount of money they've invested. Yes, they've invested a lot, but if that money goes away, they can live with it. pure play AI companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Perplexity, they're not even public yet, and they are the ones that will need money in the future. So there's a market pushback that's financially driven. There's another pushback now that's driven by what we originally kind of thought was people worried about their jobs. There was an overall societal pushback of, well, we can't do this. People are going to lose their jobs. They're already losing their jobs. That's not the case. People are losing their jobs, but usually the stated reason when it's AI is that they're really cutting back to spend money on AI. People aren't being replaced by an AI. So you've got a pushback that started with people and organizations claiming that AI would initially uh, cause mass unemployment. That's no longer a concern, or not as big a concern, simply because AI has proven useful in most of the places where it's been used. The pushback is now coming from two places that you really wouldn't expect, because it's two places where the people behind it really aren't the users of AI. The first is in the pushback against data centers. And data centers are being built en masse in order to literally fuel the processing of AI prompts and run AI programs. And those data centers require, millions of gallons of water and gigawatts of electricity in order to run. They're huge. They're oftentimes the size of 10 or 20 Home Depots, and they're going up in people's neighborhoods, and people don't want them there because they're loud, they suck water out of the ground, and they use a lot of local electricity. So you're getting a lot of consumer pushback, especially in rural areas, from people who might not even use AI, but are concerned with the environmental impact that the technology is having in the form of data centers. And just this week, New York State put a ban on the creation of new data centers. And that's happening across the country. 60% of all data center projects that were slated to open in 2027 haven't even started yet because of the pushback from community. So that becomes a financial liability for all those companies, the AI companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera. If they can't get that power, then eventually that could cause them problems as they won't be able to grow in the way that they've planned, simply because there won't be the power to do that. The second half of that pushback, completely opposite from rural residents who are upset and dismayed and angered about these data centers taking up their neighborhoods and their cities, is coming from CEOs of organizations that are using AI. And again, CEOs aren't typically the kind of user of AI that we would think of. So you've got residential users who probably don't use AI, and you've got CEOs who probably don't use AI. But the CEOs are pushing back because in large banks, large law firms, many large corporations are dependent upon ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity in order to run their internal AI programs. The problem with that is that the companies are giving those AI platforms, the OpenAIs, the Perplexities of the world, their data in order to use AI. So if I'm a bank and I want to create my own AI internally, I still have to go to OpenAI and use ChatGPT and build on top of that. Well, ChatGPT is using my information to train other things. And the CEOs of these companies are starting to say, wait a second, we're paying you to host us. We're not paying you to use our information, and our information needs to be better protected. So there's this underlying, and now it's becoming an overt concern amongst large corporations that depending on these pure play AI companies may not be all that valuable in the long run, simply because their proprietary data is no longer under their control. So the pushback is not what it was a year or 2 years ago when it was people fearing for their jobs. It's now CEOs and consumers really looking at the cost and the value of the technology and what it takes to run it. So that's my story of the pushback of it. pushback on AI after having looked at this for decades. Um, Having given you that spiel, I do want to turn it over to Mary Abbazia, a woman I've known almost as long as I've been writing about AI, who's a longtime friend and obviously knows a great deal about things like marketing and leadership and team building. So I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you very much, Harvey. I feel just so honored that you're part of our group here today. I mean, you got to check Harvey out, his website. He's written so many cool books that, it's just amazing to sit down and have a drink with him. So anyway, thank you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We all fly. So when I saw a recent article from Bloomberg about how Delta is offering a cheaper way for us to fly first class with fewer perks, I wanted to check it out. Of course, as a traveler and as a strategic marketer, Delta has announced that it will introduce multiple fare options within its premium cabins. This is as they continue to focus on what they're calling the front of the cabin. As we know, airlines traditionally segment flyers based on cabin selection, economy, sometimes there's premium economy, business, and first class, which is largely on how much we are willing to pay or how much we can get reimbursed for. So Delta is now adding another layer. Instead of just asking us, which cabin do you want? They're also asking which benefits within that cabin do you value? So imagine two travelers booking the exact same flight, overnight flight from New York to Paris. Both want that lie flat Delta One seat. One person really values the lounge access, in-flight drinks and meals, and priority service. The other person simply wants a comfortable seat and a good night's sleep. So, they're going to an important meeting. Historically, these two flyers paid they bought the same product basically. So Delta's new model recognizes the fact that customers don't value every part of the premium experience equally. So under Delta's new model, we'll be able to choose different features based on what we value. So it might be the lounge access, seat selection, other loyalty benefits. And this illustrates need-based segmentation, really understanding the needs of the customer. And these insights will give Delta the opportunity to tailor the offers to us and, of course, monetize its premium offerings better. And it has the potential to increase the customer satisfaction because travelers will be able to just pay for what necessarily they want. And airlines are always a great industry to find several different customer models. To contrast what Delta's doing, let's look at Southwest Airlines. So they provided their customers with open seating, one class of service, pretty much a one size fits all for over 50 years. And this is interesting. The management within Southwest had research showing that their customers and potential customers, 80% of them preferred to have assigned seating, and they are willing to pay more for those assigned seats. So finally, in January of this year, Southwest fully implemented differentiated seating options. So, of course, any type of customized offering is going to have a flip side. In addition, when you have additional offerings, choice can create confusion, decision fatigue, and the buying experience can become just harder, not easier. So there's this internal challenge of ensuring that the systems and the processes all work together. So it really is a balancing game. Customer value, segmentation, pricing strategies, these are all concepts that we spend a great deal of time on at our Caltech programs when we're teaching these. One of the biggest questions that we get asked is, okay, it sounds interesting, but how do you really measure value? How do you uncover customers' different needs, segment them, and create unique offers? And then how do you really capture different pricing? So one of the research approaches that we often use is called conjoint analysis or consider jointly. It's a type of trade-off research rather than asking someone straight out, would you buy this? Conjoint analysis presents customers with different options or bundles of features and prices, similar to when you buy a car. Would you like a sunroof and leather seats, or would you like to have a upgraded sound system and a sports performance package? And then pricing is, of course, part of that trade-off. By analyzing these results, we can figure out which features that customers value most, which trade-offs they're willing to make, and how much they're willing to pay for these different things. And those insights often allow us also to identify groups of customers that have similar priorities, or what we call segments. And there's usually, 3 to 5, and then companies are able to bundle services for those different customer needs. So the lesson here extends well beyond the airline industry, of course. Most companies claim that they're segmenting their customers, but often they use what we call classification. They group customers based on what the company wants. Of course, large customers, big budgets. Those classifications typically are labeled like A, B, C customer tiers. And the problem is that not much research is done to understand customer needs. And as we know, 2A customers may have very different motivations for buying and the types of things that they want. So it doesn't allow them to really get to the heart and tailor what each of those big customers would buy and actually pay more for. So the question for your organization is, are you offering customers a just one size fits all, or are you providing them with something that they want based on their needs, and you're able to tailor it to them? So hopefully you'll think about this one a little bit more. And now I'm going to pass the ball over to our innovation guru, Bryan Mattimore. Bryan?
Well, thank you, Mary. By the way, I live in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and the next town over, Holyoke. The city council met last week, I think it was, and they prohibited a data center proposal. I think it was for 3 years or maybe for 5 years. So, Harvey, right on. Today I want to give you a preview of a new book I'm working on, and I want to introduce it this way. With a prediction. I predict in the next 5 years, many organizations will create a brand new executive position. And it's not the one that probably comes to mind right away, the AI, head of AI. That certainly is and will be a new job title, right? Chief AI Officer. I believe it's inevitable. Some organizations will create what I'm calling a Chief Discovery Officer, or CDO. So how is a CDO, Chief Discovery Officer, different than current functions within an organization? I mean, we have marketing research, to Mary's point, looking at customer and consumer behavior and unmet needs. Research and development, they're looking at new technologies, inventing new products. Chief Innovation Officers, which started to appear like 20 years ago, they're discovering and commercializing these ideas. So what's with the new executive position? Well, the difference is the Chief Discovery Officer will be asking different questions and looking for opportunities of all kinds, not just new products or growth opportunities or whatever, but efficiency ideas, service ideas, internal process ideas for every department, right? So both internally and externally. You could think of it almost as an internal think tank. And this group will be, thanks to Caltech here and what we've titled ourselves, they will be driven by curiosities, large and small. And they'll continually be asking, what are we missing? So questions like, what are the assumptions we're making about our business? Big questions, right? That have become or will become outdated. What strange consumer behaviors are we dismissing as too small or irrelevant? What tiny anomalies in our business and the world deserve another look? What ambiguities can't we explain, and on and on and on. The Chief Discovery Officer, his or her job, they'll be empowered to wander and to wonder, right? How great is that? Sign me up here. They'll be looking for exceptions, not averages, right? They'll be asking questions nobody else is asking, right? Um, and what's interesting is why do you need a new title? It's been shown, history has shown us again and again, um, something I think fascinating. The future almost never arrives looking important. Obviously, there are exceptions, but as I love this quote from the science fiction writer William Gibson. He said in 1999, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, and it's not distributed loudly, right?" So. Just a couple of quick examples. Adults buying Lego sets looked like a quirky hobby. Lego looked into this and realized there was a real opportunity here to create, sophisticated architecture sets and engineering models and movie collaborations and collector editions, and it's now one of their fastest growing segments. Japanese teenagers decorating their cell phones looked like teenage fashion, right? It turned out to be an early sign that people would come to see technology not just as a tool, but as an expression of identity, right? Museums creating spaces specifically for selfies looked like a gimmick. We did work with the USTA and we had, cardboard cutouts of the greats that you could take a picture with. It looked like a hokey gimmick. But these are, it turned out an early signal that visitors want not just consuming the experiences, they wanted experiences worth sharing. Right. So now we're in the sharing world here. So these were previews. Now, what would the chief discovery officer actually do? Well, the first thing, absolutely positively, we need to replace the suggestion box, right? This has been a dismal failure with a few exceptions in corporate America, Frito-Lay and others, but Dart Industries. But what would they do? Well, they'd replace the suggestion box with a question box. How cool is that, right? Employees wouldn't submit ideas; they'd submit questions, observations, contradictions, consumer behaviors that don't make sense, right? Um, uh, Second, part of their job will be to create what are called whiteboards. Or the whiteboard technique is something we developed a dozen years ago. We've had our clients been doing it for a dozen years. It's essentially placing whiteboards around where people write down questions, thoughts, trends, insights, and everybody in the organization or the department participates in that. And so the chief discovery officer and his or her team would take all that stuff and build, interesting initiatives based on that. Um, you know, uh, for instance, one is what customer behavior you've noticed recently that doesn't make sense? Well, buying vinyl records, right? Surprise, right? Okay. Um, so they write all this stuff down, and again, the chief discovery officer in charge of developing those insights and ideas that come from that. So the key here is that the CDO is not tasked with finding answers; they're finding better questions, right? And that's a salute to Curious and Quirky here. Um, I guess the essential question is what are we not noticing because we're too busy looking where everybody else is living is one way to, or looking is one way to think of it. And finally, this brings up for me the quote, Ken Berg's quote. It's not his quote. He's repeated it in many interviews he's given. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. We've heard that, right? Well, what's a quote we might have about the future? And my quote might be, the future rarely shouts, it usually whispers. And so it's important that we, quote, listen for the whispers. Okay, so Ginny will not be whispering.
No, I won't.
Ginny, our OD expert, will be very loud and opinionated, and we love her for that. So, Ginny, you're up.
You hit the mark on that. Well, Tim opened us up with a World Cup analogy, and coincidentally, I will be talking about goals. That was my dad joke, Tim. So there you go. So one of the most important responsibilities, if not the most important responsibility of a CEO, is setting clear strategic goals that align the organization, drive performance, and define long-term success. And yet, setting clear strategic goals is what CEOs tend to struggle with the most. So why, you ask? Because they have a difficult time prioritizing. To speak loudly, I do feel very strongly about this topic. And what brought it to the surface recently is when I came across an article in the New York Times last month entitled, Elon Musk Laid Out 602 Goals. And the New York Times counted how many he hit. And so, according to the article, the analysis found that of the statements Mr. Musk has made about his businesses on social media or during investor calls over the last 15 years, he delivered only some of what he said he would when he said he would. And now I'm going to quote the article. Of more than 600 claims Mr. Musk has made, he achieved what he said he would only about 19% of the time. He was late, sometimes by years, or did not deliver on his goals about 35% of the time. For about 33% of Mr. Musk's plans, he or his companies did not provide a public update, or they were too vague to know if he succeeded. And about 13% of Mr. Musk's goals came with delivery dates that are still in the future. End of quote. So I use Elon Musk as an example of this prioritization struggle that most leaders demonstrate. And yes, having 600 goals is the extreme end of the spectrum, is kind of a hedging your bets strategy, and is a terrible use and management of resources. However, in the many years I have worked directly with CEOs, it's not unusual to hear, I have 100 number one priorities. My answer to that is simple. No, you cannot. To lead an organization effectively and lead people effectively, employees need to be aligned to the organization's vision, mission, and goals. Every employee needs to have a line of sight to how what they do fits into the goals of the organization. Line of sight keeps all the resources working in the same direction, creates a velocity of achievement, and motivates the workforce. Am I motivated if all my efforts go into the black hole of the unknown? Obviously, no. If the workforce is being directed to accomplish 600 goals, 100 goals, or even 20 goals, is it possible to be successful? The key is how success is measured. Yes, activity will happen, work will get done, things will be achieved, but will the mission and vision of the company be realized? Probably not. So this brings me to the very familiar construct of mission, vision, and goals. We've all heard about it, but it's worth repeating because sometimes this gets very confusing to people. So mission is the organization today, the organization's purpose. Vision is the organization's future destination. The vision should balance both aspiration and reality. It just can't be this kind of dream out there. And goals are how the mission is achieved today and how the future will be reached tomorrow. If the work is not aligned to the mission and vision, if there are 600 ways to reach the vision or even 60, how can success be accomplished? Goals must be memorable and remembered. If there are more than 5, the journey to achieve the mission and reach the future vision becomes unfocused and diffused. So now I'm going to go back to that New York Times article, and I'm quoting it. In April 2024, Mr. Musk told SpaceX employees that he expected 1 million people to be living on Mars in about 20 years. He had quietly directed employees to begin working on plans for a city there. So 2 years later, in February of 2026, Mr. Musk revised his thinking again, saying that creating a Martian city would take 20 plus years, not the 20 previously stated. And instead, he said SpaceX would colonize on the moon. End of quote. So I had fun contrasting this with one of the most iconic examples of a good mission statement, and you're probably all very familiar with it. So the example of a good mission statement is President John F. Kennedy's core mission statement for the moon, which he declared on May 25th, 1961. And I quote him, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." This statement officially launched the Apollo program, pushing NASA to focus its resources, technology, and energy on winning the space race against the Soviet Union. And as we know, this mission was ultimately achieved 8 years later on July 20th, 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface. So very interesting contrasts of leaders in current leader and historical leader. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alan, our supply chain guru.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I always learn so much when I follow you because I pay a lot of attention to make sure I get all the cues right to start my program, and I just get absorbed into what you're talking about. This is the reason why Jenny is probably the best coach of leaders that I've ever met in my life. I want to talk today about AI because everything we talk about these days is AI. AI kind of sucks the air out of every room that I go into. But I want to talk about AI in customer service because customer service is oftentimes a process that we use as a result of a failing in supply chain. So I want to talk about what I call the AI personalization paradox, particularly in customer service, or really kind of why customer service feels kind of less human than ever. So I want you to just to kind of lean back, stare at the ceiling for a second, and I want you to put the creative side of your brain into gear. I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you've ordered something from some supplier, your package is late, you then go online, you open up a chat window, you meet an AI assistant that greets you instantly. It knows your name, it knows what you ordered, it knows when you purchased it, and then it even apologizes for the inconvenience. And yet, within about 30 seconds, you're feeling annoyed. You ever experienced that? Have you asked why? Well, probably the reason is because despite all the information that's being provided to you through this AI-enabled system, it doesn't really feel like anyone actually understands your problem. This is what I consider the paradox of most customer service, particularly as it relates to supply chain or more succinctly, where's my package? We've been told that artificial intelligence would usher in an age of hyper-personalization. More data would mean more understanding, more automation would mean better experiences, but a lot of customers are experiencing the exact opposite. We recently participated with another company on a study that looked at customer service, particularly in supply chain, particularly in the logistics side of supply chain. And according to this research, roughly about 73% of consumers, this is on the last mile shipments, said they wanted a personalized experience, but many of them spent significantly more on brands that delivered them, and so there was some reason for trying to offer them a hyper personalized service or service promise because they tend to be more loyal, they tend to spend more money. Yet a majority of the same respondents also reported that the so-called personalized interactions typically felt generic, or they felt scripted, or they even felt irrelevant. In other words, it seems that companies think that they're personalizing using their AI tools, but their customers tend to not agree. By the way, just for kicks, go try to rent a car online with Avis, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Not just Avis, probably any rental car company. The reason that they don't feel the same way as the designer of these systems think they should feel could be surprisingly simple. Companies have confused knowing about customers with understanding a customer. If I've learned anything from Mary, and Tom, I've learned that understanding a customer is not an easy thing to do. Thinking you understand, pretty easy. AI itself is extraordinarily good at recognizing patterns. I've worked with 9 different platforms over the last 2 years, trying to understand this technology as much as I possibly can. And what I've noticed is that it can predict what you might buy. It can even recommend products and services. It can optimize prices. It can answer routine questions, but customer service isn't truly tested when everything goes smoothly or when I'm researching for something. Customer service is tested when something goes wrong, when a product is defective, when there's a billing dispute or a missed delivery. These are the kinds of things that really test customer service. These moments tend to push customers out of a transaction and into a relationship. I want you to remember that. And relationships operate far differently than transactions. Again, by the way, something I've learned from Marion and echoed by Tom as well as by Brian is that there's a difference between a relationship and a transaction. Customers aren't looking necessarily for speed. They like that. But what they're really looking for is validation, for understanding and confidence that somebody cares enough to solve their problem. In our research, which we'll be publishing very shortly here in the form of a couple articles, supply chain customer service, we discovered, customer service success, I should say, is not the same as the customer experience success. In other words, what we think we're serving isn't necessarily what we're serving. And now we have AI systems that speed up the process, sometimes just making things worse faster than ever before. And the AI system should be able to successfully close a ticket while simultaneously leaving a customer satisfied, except it's not. Typically, while we're closing an after-sales service ticket, typically the customers are left less than satisfied or even frustrated. You ask the question, why? Well, what we've kind of looked at is we've kind of looked at how customers think. And we discovered that, customers or humans instinctively know the difference between being processed and being understood. And AI now has accelerated how they feel processed. Think about the last time you dealt with customer service. The most memorable service experience probably wasn't the fastest one. It was probably an interaction where a person listened, adapted, and solved your problem. So what customers really say they want, it turns out, is 4 things. In this online, logistics-centric sort of world, they want empathy, real serious empathy, not scripted empathy. Well, one of the things we hear, particularly with public utilities and others that have been regulated for so long and now are actually having to compete, is that they can't apologize enough and they can't apologize strongly enough, and yet it feels scripted because it is. We want sincerity. That's where empathy and sincerity means a human. But here's the thing that we discovered more than anything. What they want is authority. Customers want the person they're talking to solve the problem. They want that person to have the authority to solve the problem. They don't want to have to ratchet it up to another level or transfer to another number or transfer to another agency. They want the person they're calling, who is a customer service representative, they want that person to be able to solve the problem, not to be a gatekeeper. And they want that person to be adaptable. That means that they want the person to really try to adapt themselves to the customer's viewpoint and adapt themselves to what the customer is experiencing. They don't want a script. They don't want workflow. They don't care about workflow. They don't want a chat bot endlessly asking whether your issues fall into category A or category B. What they want is they want somebody who can help them. In other words, what makes this especially challenging for AI is that personalization is not simply about historical data. It's about present context. I'll say that again. It's about present context. We want a recommendation that can be accurate and to be correct. We don't want a recommendation that can be accurate and still feels wrong, or a message that can be relevant and still feels impersonal, or a response that can be factually correct and still leaves the customer or leaves us feeling unheard. And when personalization fails in the customer service role, it doesn't just fail to create value, it actually damages trust. Trust is so important. By the way, trust in customer service, when it exists, elevates you from customer satisfaction to customer loyalty. And we've noted that poorly executed personalization can actually make customers significantly less loyal, which means significantly less likely to buy from you again. So what's the lesson? It's not that AI in customer service is the problem. In fact, AI is remarkably good at so many aspects of customer service, all the routine stuff. The real mistake is expecting AI to replace the parts of the experience that are fundamentally human. The most promising model that we've worked with in terms of AI, even the best one has these same sort of failings. The most promising model isn't AI versus people. This is important now. It's AI plus trained, empathetic, and adaptive people who have authority. In other words, we can amplify humans' performance if it's done correctly. Let AI handle the repetitive questions, retrieve information instantly, and streamline routine processes. Then empower skilled human representatives to step in when judgment, empathy, context, and flexibility matter the most. Why? Because loyalty isn't built when a system successfully completes a workflow. Loyalty is built when a customer feels understood. And that brings me to my final thought. For decades, companies competed on price, then on product, then on convenience. Every manufacturing company and supply chain element that I've ever worked with, these are the areas that they've competed on. Today, all these competitive advantages are increasingly easy to copy, mainly in this globalized supply chain world. The one thing that remains difficult to automate, however, is authentic human connection. So perhaps the future of customer service isn't asking how AI can become more human. Perhaps it's asking how AI can free humans to be more human. And then that answer may be the difference between personalization that's measured in algorithms and personalization that's actually and felt and actually appreciated by customers who will reward your efforts with loyalty. That's my take on AI in the customer service element of supply chain. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tim to bring this home.
All right. Thanks, Alan. So many good topics today. I'm very happy with the diversity here because I've written down probably about 10 questions. I know we want to have time to answer, but lots of great thoughts going through my head across all the different disciplines. I'm going to take it a little bit to a different direction. I've been talking with a lot of people recently who are preparing and studying for interviews. And like a lot of people, it really got me thinking about the hiring process and especially the interviews. Not just how to answer specific questions that may come up, but whether we're asking even the right ones. The iconic questions typically come to mind are, well, tell me about yourself, or what's your biggest weakness, or describe a time you dealt with conflict, or you had to give poor performance ratings to somebody, and how did you handle that, et cetera, yada, yada, yada. But then my mind works in really random ways. And so then for some random reason, my mind drifted to the story of Ernest Shackleton. These random drifts seem to be a recurring experience in my life, but it's going to go somewhere, I promise you. So just hold on with me for just a few minutes. If you haven't heard of Ernest Shackleton, he's probably one of my favorite leaders to speak about. He led one of the most famous Antarctic expeditions in history. His ship actually got stuck in the ice in the middle of the Antarctic. Eventually, it sank in a frozen place, and his crew had to spend months, almost 6 to 9 months, stranded in the middle of Antarctica in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Alan will eventually get to go there one day, and he'll be able to tell us all about it. There's a famous newspaper clipping of a recruiting ad that's often attributed to him. Men wanted for a hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, and constant danger. Safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. Who wouldn't want to go work for that guy? Sounds like a great job. Historians have searched for years, but have never really found evidence that that ad actually existed. But I love it because I think it summarized Shackleton's hiring philosophy perfectly. He was not a person who was obsessed with credentials. He wasn't looking for the most impressive resume. He was trying to answer, I'll say, a much harder question or a much more innate question that you can't really see written on paper. What do I want? Who do I want standing beside me when everything falls apart? That's fundamentally the question he was trying to ask. So let me ask you guys something. Imagine you have two candidates. Candidate A has an incredible resume. Great schools, maybe they went to Ivy League or heck, maybe they went to Caltech. They've got great experience, they're confident, they're well polished, and they absolutely just crush the interview, 100%. But candidate B is different. They're a little awkward. The resume doesn't necessarily stand out. They don't have all the perfect answers. But you know something else about candidate B, that when deadlines start slipping, they stay. When everyone else is exhausted, they pick up another task. And they don't complain much. They don't care whose job it is. They just roll up their sleeves and help the team get across the finish line. Who are you going to hire? Right? Most most of us, I think in your heads, you say, I want to pick candidate B, which leads me to a follow-on question that I couldn't stop thinking about when I offer candidates A and B in my own head. If we all choose candidate B in this particular scenario, why do so many organizations end up hiring candidate A? Now, I don't think it's because hiring managers are bad at their jobs or that they have this innate, distaste for people who are awkward in interviews, things like that. But I think it's because we measure what's easy to measure. Resumes are easy. There's tangible evidence that I could point to and say, this is why I hired this person. It's not subjective like some of these other things are. Specific experience that people have is easy to measure against. Technical questions and answers that you get back from somebody is easy to measure. But character, emotions and character and behavior and cultural fit is really, really hard to measure. Now, I've seen people interview incredibly well. They've had a very strong background. They said all the right things. And on paper, they looked like the perfect hire. Then they joined the team. Technically, they were knocking it out of the park and doing exactly what they needed to do. But they brought negativity into every meeting and they slowly began to poison the well. Now, every setback that we incurred in those environments became someone else's fault. No ownership or accountability was held by that person. Every challenge became yet another reason to complain. And over time, I think overall that did more damage to the team and to the organization than any technical weakness ever could. So when I think about the people I personally would go to war with, I don't think about the smartest people I've ever worked with. I think about the ones who always showed up, the ones who never acted like a task was beneath them, the people who, when everything started falling apart, somehow made the rest of the team believe that they could still pull it off. Those are the people I would fight for to keep on my team. And maybe that's what Shackleton understood well before the rest of us. He wasn't hiring people to complete tasks. He was choosing people he'd trust with his life because he knew while he didn't expect to be stuck in the ice for 6 to 9 months and have to survive in that type of environment, he knew that was a probability and potentially a higher likelihood than zero. So he wanted to choose those people. Someone recently was talking to me about this Japanese word. It's called kintsugi, right? It's the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. So instead of hiding all the cracks that have been made by broken pottery, they're actually highlighted with a mix of gold or silver or other types of metals that glue everything back together. And the piece isn't valuable because it wasn't ever broken. It's valuable because what it became after it was broken. And I think people are a lot like that, and organizations are a lot like that. Some of the strongest teammates and colleagues that I've ever known, they didn't have perfect careers. I don't think any one of us on the call would say that we've had a perfect career. We've all lived through failed programs or failed scenarios or failed negotiations. We've worked with difficult leaders, projects that went completely sideways, and we've all made specific mistakes, whether they're small, medium, or even large. But those people owned those mistakes and they actually took something away and they learned something specifically from them. Those cracks and scars didn't necessarily make them weaker. That scar tissue became the reason, I could trust those people. So maybe we've been asking the wrong interview questions all along. And I started thinking a lot about if Shackleton were here today, sitting across the table from me in a specific interview, I don't think he'd ask about their 5-year plan Or how do you translate this into a vision for this execution role? I don't think you'd ask them to walk through the resume. I think you'd ask them one very simple question. When everything stopped going according to plan, who did the people around you become because you were there? Think about that. Not what did you accomplish, not what title did you have, not whether you were the smartest person in the room. Who did the people around you become because you were there? Did they become calmer? Did they become more confident, more empowered, more accountable? Did they become better because you were specifically were on the team? Because when I think about a resume tells me what you've done, and an interview tells me how well you've prepared. But the answer to that question, that tells me who you really are. All right, so with that, we'll bring everyone back to the table, and I have questions, and I'm sure everyone else has questions. A thought for HP, though, if you don't mind. We talked about this pushback we're seeing from all the different organizations, and Brian talked about in Massachusetts, I think, and then you talked about New York. I went back home recently, and in my hometown, or a very small town outside my hometown, about 3,000 people live there. A huge new data center is being stood up just on the outskirts of that town. And no one in that town really cares or understands about AI. My mom didn't even know it was even there until we drove around and showed her. But like I said, massive Home Depot size, 12 things, interstates. So how does he get through some of the wickets and some of these other major cities are pushing back while some of maybe these smaller, let's say West Texas types of towns, how does it get through those wickets? And they're like, okay, yeah, let's just do it. I don't understand the differentiation between how it's okay in some cases, but other cases there's a lot of pushback.
Well, you have to look at the political infrastructure. For instance, the state of Virginia has 600 data centers, more than most of the other states combined. There's
Mhm.
close to 5,000 in America, all told.
Okay.
Basically, there's a huge incentive that's usually paid. We'll bring in workers, we'll bring in tax revenue, uh, we'll employ people over time, which is kind of a mixed bargain because it takes a lot of people to build those places. But
Right.
once they're done, which takes usually 2 years, the data centers run themselves essentially. You can run them with a skeleton crew. So that long-term employment thing is not really holding up. But you do have the promise of an initial increase in the workforce. You got the tax revenue promise. Um, in rural Utah, Kevin O'Leary, who's the investor that's on Shark Tank,
Mhm.
just had to scale back his most recent investment, which was a data center that was 22 square miles. So
Wow. Jeez.
basically, over the size, larger than Manhattan. And the state was like, great, we love it. It's in the middle of nowhere. But for the people where it wasn't in the middle of nowhere, for those who would have their electrical use either
Mhm.
go up or be compromised, for those who are worried about water, and Utah is
Yeah.
basically a desert state, the pushback came even after the state had approved it. So a lot of what's happening is whether or not the state is actually predisposed to want that kind of income and surge in employment growth versus more populated areas where people don't want to hear gas turbines running in their backyard 24 hours a day or
Right.
worry about the water pressure in their household.
That's right. Yeah, no, that
Yes.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Harvey the second part. Harvey, you had mentioned the second pushback is that CEOs don't want to train the AI. I'm curious, either what do the AI companies need to do to address their concern, or you can answer what should the CEOs do? Is there a workaround that they don't end up training?
Well, right now, one of AI's least favorite people, Alex Karp of Palantir, is the one waving the flag on this. And he's saying basically what a lot of other CEOs would not say, which is everything I was talking about earlier. We're giving over our data to these companies. And the pushback on that may end up resulting in companies deciding they are going to create their own LLMs internally. They're not going to use the existing platforms. Um, one of the pushes that China is making to governments around the world is use our LLMs. They're open source. Xi Jinping just yesterday announced a 30-nation consortium that's going to use AI developed in China. They're not using American developed AI, they're using Chinese developed. And that's all open source, which, as most people know, anybody can use and anybody can modify. And that's what some of the CEOs of these large corporations that are building internal AI structures on top of existing LLMs are concerned about. Maybe we should not use OpenAI. Maybe we shouldn't use Claude. Maybe we should build our own from scratch, or we should find some kind of concession from these LLM companies. So that's coming very quickly. You're going to hear more about that, in the course of the next few months.
Thank you for that.
Thanks.
I think one final question here before we wrap up. Mary, question for you on the whole idea of the multiple cabins and this new kind of segmentation model. Do you think that with this new segmentation model, this is going to now create segment more, I'll say feature fatigue for all the people actually going through and now picking and choosing all the specific types of things? Because I think overall comparison shopping could start getting very complicated when it comes to comparing between one or the other because you don't know exactly everything else that's in place.
Yeah, I love your question. And I was thinking about that too, because I can imagine 2 hours trying to figure out a flight. But I do think if they do it the Apple way, Apple is one of the most complex technologies, yet we don't feel like it because it serves it up to us in the right way so that we can make simple choices. So it really depends on how they execute it. It could blow up, or they could make it so that they understand our needs as customers well enough to serve up the things that make sense to us. So we don't feel like we have to do 110 features.
Yeah, no, that's important. I think, I was at the airport, just a couple weeks ago, and I was just getting a drink from one of the shops there. And I think, they have the automated checkout systems nowadays. And I swear I had to answer like 5 questions or 6 questions on the keypad just to actually pay for my card. It's,
Makes no
do you want
sense.
any bags? Do you want to donate? Do you want to round up? Do you want to use your card? Do you want to tap or swipe? I'm like, dude, I just want to pay for my drink. I don't need to answer like 60 questions.
Right.
So it was really frustrating. And I started thinking about, why am I being asked all these questions to actually pay for something that you're going to make a ton of profit on? And it just seems unnecessary at that point. So I started thinking about when you were talking, adding all these features and everything else and choices, it just gets very complicated very quickly. So appreciate that.
Yeah,
Well, that's the,
Tim, I was
yeah,
just going to say, I think we'll see a lot of bundling, right? Like when we
yeah,
go to get our car serviced, well, you can get package 1, 2, or 3.
yeah. That should
And
be, it should help assuage some
yeah,
of that for sure. Yeah.
So
Thanks for that.
I want to build on that. So this is directed to Mary and to Brian. It seems like generationally we go from bundling to unbundling, back to bundling, and and I'm not sure where we're at right now. I think we're on the path to bundle, but I'm not really sure.
Back to
It
bundle.
seems like from a
or
marketing perspective, this is a trend that happens every several years. I mean,
well, we're bumbling, not bundling.
Bumbling.
Mary,
I guess that's
Mary, go
well,
ahead.
I'm definitely familiar with that strategy. So okay.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, if Tom was here, he would say, he's been working on one-to-one strategy for decades, and this technology that's here now, you actually wouldn't even know you're being bundled to. So,
That's
Oh.
right. Wonderful. All right, friends. Well, that's the final whistle on this July edition of Curious and Quirky. Today was a reminder that whether we're talking about AI, innovation, leadership, or even the human side, the human instinct to resist change, progress rarely moves in a straight line. Sometimes it takes a bold strategy, sometimes it takes a surprising substitution, and sometimes it takes realizing the playbook everyone trusts may be overdue for an update. A World Cup size thank you to our speakers and special guests for bringing fresh perspectives, challenging a few assumptions, and keeping today's conversation out of the boring end of the field. If these ideas sparked your curiosity, many of the themes we explore around innovation and leadership and strategy and organizational change and even emerging technology are covered in greater depth through the certificate programs offered by the Caltech Executive Education. So take what you heard today, put it into play, because great ideas don't win from the sidelines.